it's okay to have questions about a chapter and still move on from it. Some people want to have everything perfect before they move forward in a book. I feel like, I'll often have questions or just not know what's going on with the chapter, but keep moving forward to find where the plot is going, find where the story really needs to head. And, that's kind of how I keep my writing momentum going. The wind behind my back is like, I'm not going to worry too much about what any part is doing. It'll all make sense later. And once you've written the whole book, then, this chapter 3 for you might be perfect. It might be something that you wind up throwing out altogether. It might be something that you trim, any number of things.
Right.
One of the things that I'm working on with a couple of different students now who are doing novels is, the scenario process that Stephen Koch talks about in that revision handout that I've given to a number of you. Anyone remember having read? Okay, so good. So he talks about writing a scenario once you've written the novel, and it sort of amounts to writing a kind of like an outline once you've already written the book. And I think at that point, writing that scenario, it's like really boiled down, just like scene 1, this happens, scene 2, this happens, scene 3, this happens, or chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And it's just like the events, where they take place, who's there, what happens. Doing that process really helps you pull back and look at the whole thing from a macro sort of zoomed out point of view. And that can be really helpful to give yourself notes that ask questions, notes and questions that you can then use for revision. So I was talking to Liz about this week, and I was showing her some of my scenarios that I did for one of my recent books. And what I was really doing there was laying out all the scenes and then able to put in questions of my own. So, if you just move on from this chapter 3, later on you do the scenario, you read it again, you might have totally different thoughts about it, or you might have the same thoughts, and at that point you just put them in parentheses and say, these are my concerns for it. So if I'm doing that, it looks like this. Can you guys see this one? It says scenario fast. This is
Yeah.
like a very preliminary scenario for what I'm working on. It's sort of got like, these are what the scenes are about. But then as I'm doing that, I'm writing in here in bold for myself, this part needs work. This part needs work. Here's a question. How long has this guy been dead? Here's the answer. Here's me telling myself that the dialogue here isn't that good and it needs to be more punchy. I need to add a character in this scene. So I can, when I sort of pull back and get to that kind of outline mode, it's helpful to me to give myself notes that are sort of structural revision. Before I go in and start doing craft revision, I'm going to do structural revision. And often it's easier for me to see what I need to do there when I'm working on a scenario like this. So a little bit further down the line for the same book, I did a longer scenario. This one's over 1,000 words and basically goes through the entire plot. And so, I'm putting in things about like, where does this scene take place? I realized that I needed to figure out sort of when things happen in the timeline. Interesting quotes, this is a different day. Here's something that I need to take out of this scene. Here's where I'm saying I add something to make it pattern. Add something to sort of make this guy kind of a serial killer element. Yeah, and so I'm sort of giving myself notes about what's happening. Part of it is the thematic stuff that King talks about, where I'm sort of realizing what the larger themes are and giving myself notes on how to bump that up. And then some of it is just revision notes. Here I'm saying, something needs to happen here. You know, different thoughts about what's going to change. What happens here? Is she alive? Change the pimp's name. Ask him for names. So anyway, you can see I'm making a lot of notes to myself and sort of figuring it out on my own as I go through this draft in the kind of macro scenario sense. And what I've done in the past is I'll do this kind of scenario on the computer and then print it out and have it on the wall next to where I'm working, and then even go through and make notes on a Sharpie on it as I'm going through and working. I'll realize there are additional things that I need to do, and so I'll just have this whole thing on the wall where I can then cross off or make checks next to things that I said I needed to do, and add additional notes as I'm learning more about the draft when I'm in the revision mode. But I think, to pull back and sort of generalize from all this, there's something to be said in the rough draft mode of just kind of moving forward and not spending too much time figuring out if something's perfect or not, because often you can't really tell from that vantage. And then once you've finished a draft, there's something that's a good moment to really pull back and look at the entire structure from a zoomed out point of view. And you can do a lot in that moment, using scenarios to really do big picture and structural stuff. That's my mini lecture for this week.